Nigeria Country Representative, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, June Jane, joins me live for more on this. Good to have you join us.
Thank you so much for having me, Precious.
So now we are seeing more people displaced by wars. We just took the story from Sudan, which has now been termed the world's worst humanitarian crisis. There are also environmental challenges, especially, like I mentioned, in Africa. How would you say that this has impacted refugees, especially in the face of limited human resources, we understand?
Well, today is World Refugee Day, 20th of June, and it's a day when we're supposed to commemorate the resilience and strength of the refugees and other displaced communities. But today is not business as usual. Today is a sad day for two reasons. Firstly, because the number of displaced communities has gone up to an unprecedented number of 123 million, which means 1 out of every 67 people in the world is forced to be displaced. In Africa itself, including in Sudan that you mentioned, 45 million people are forced to be displaced, exiled from their homes, of which around 35 million of them are internally displaced, that is within their country. Now, this comes at an unprecedented time of extreme funding shortfalls. A number of our agencies, the UN Refugee Agency that I'm with, but also other agencies that help refugees, including UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and others, are facing extreme funding shortfalls. This has been in the making for many years, but this year it's been extremely difficult for us. So what does that really mean for us in Nigeria? What does it mean for us in Africa? It means that we will have fewer resources to support forcibly displaced people. There will be less to give them. Assistance when they come across the border, to register them, to provide them with shelter or food or even some clothing will be very, very difficult for us to provide. Children who are unaccompanied and separated, or single parents, or women at risk would be harder to support and protect because we just don't have the resources and the staff on the ground to help them. So you have the elderly, you have the disabled, and others who will face an extremely difficult time this year as the funding shortfalls increase.
And as we talk about wars and environmental challenges, we're just talking about the Middle East as well, Israel and Iran. You find that people are living, fleeing those countries to safer places and becoming refugees in other countries. But at the same time, countries like the US and the UK have created tighter rules for people seeking asylum. And I'm wondering, how does this again impact on the refugee itself if you can be home and then there is no safer place for you to flee?
That's a good question. Well, everyone has a right to seek and enjoy asylum. That is a well-established principle of international law. And there are very strict legal and other procedures to follow in determining who is a refugee and who is not. It's actually very difficult to be a refugee because you have to meet a very high threshold to be one. But in the whole global context, most of the refugees and most of the displaced people are living in their own countries or are displaced in neighboring countries. In fact, the refugee crisis is actually very visible in developing countries. If you look at the Syria crisis before this year, most of the Syrian refugees were living in Turkey. Iran, that you mentioned earlier in your news segment, is one of the largest, if not the largest, refugee hosting country in the world. We have refugees from Afghanistan there. So while the crises erupt and multiply and become more complicated, we have a number of displaced communities who have already fled persecution and violence, and then in a country of asylum are caught up in more violence in a situation like, say, Iran right now. So it's really important for countries in Europe and other countries to keep their borders open, to exercise their humanitarian and legal obligations, and grant asylum to people who show up there and are seeking refuge.
We understand that even that is important because in places like Sudan where they have nowhere to go, you find that in those camps, we understand that there is slavery, forced marriages, assaults and rape and all. That's why it is important that borders are open. Thank you so much for your time. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Arjun Jain, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now to the UK, members of parliament are